As David said, I work just down the road at UCL, but I'm actually coming here from Berlin, where I spent the last couple of days at the launch activities surrounding the G20 German presidency. And while we're discussing in this room the future of politics and thinking about the challenges of reforming the institutions that we work with, that was a living example of what the institutions, where they are currently at, and the challenges that they're grappling with. So while Catherine said you would have gotten a hug for the question about how do we tear down the system and start again, I don't think you would have gotten that in the room that I came from this week. But that's not because they don't understand the pressures and the challenges. In fact, the conversations with the Sherpas and with the scholars and the think tanks that they brought together there was precisely around the challenges that society faces, including the wave of populism, the wave of national retrenchment that is going through Western democracies right now, and the questions about have the institutions that we have lost faith, lost the trust of the people, the ones who government is supposed to represent. But yet that's trying to crowd into an agenda that is also packed with things like antimicrobial resistance and pandemics, and how do we prepare our health organizations to cope with that? How do we manage climate stability and all the sustainable development goals and build the institutions and the financial systems to support the changes on that front? And of course, people like jobs. People don't like it when they don't have jobs. And therefore, we need to build the financial stability and the structural mechanisms to enhance that. All in an era where digitalization, we've talked to, Tim in the panel talked a lot about the positive aspects of digitalization and what that can bring to government and to our economies. But they're also trying to deal with the negative implications that are coming about. The jobs that haven't been lost to Mexicans, as Donald Trump would have us believe, but rather to microchips that have replaced manufacturing. They're continuing as we go into the fourth industrial revolution to change the way our economies are structured, to rely far more on automation and on machine learning than human activities and human learning. And that creates the challenges, the context for a lot of the struggles that we're facing now. Now, when David asked me to come, he suggested the title, Practical Steps for Better Public Decision Making. I thought that makes a lot of sense. And now that when I was coming from the G20 here, I was going, crap, practical steps that try and deal with all of these challenges, I don't have an answer. I don't have the answer for what the practical steps are. But I do have three things that I wanted to talk through as ideas that we need to be considering. The first is how we engage scientists, technologists, those of us, I'm a physicist by training, those of us who have been involved in developing the technologies that are changing our society, and how we're preparing them to understand not just the technology that goes in the phones and the computers that we use, but the implications they have in society. And I'll talk through some examples of that. The second point that I want to make is about the way in which we structure our thinking in policymaking processes and in government. We don't build enough flexibility and adaptability into the policy solutions that we want to put forward, the institutional designs that we put forward to deal with these challenges. And the third thing is about universities. Now, I'm an academic, and therefore I like the structure that we've built in academia because it's gotten me so far in the job that I have. But I don't think it's going to be the same. It can't be the same 20 years from now as it is today, because we need much better ways of using the knowledge generation capacity and the teaching capacity we have to help our students, not just in their early 20s learn things, but throughout their lives, learn to solve real-world problems with the knowledge we have, not just sit in a classroom and do lecture. So I want to talk through those 3 points in a little bit more detail and use some examples along the way. But I wanted to just first touch on one of the questions that was asked, or several of the questions that were asked of the panel earlier on, which is about why are we focusing on improving government as opposed to politics? And I think there's 2 things about that question that can perhaps miss one of the most important points on where we are going within society. The first is we need to be thinking not in terms of government, but governance. In an era where Facebook has more users on it than most nation states on this planet, do we think of Facebook as a polity? Do we think about it as a political entity? Well, we should, and so should all the technologists who were involved in it. We need to be thinking about responsibility, not just in government, but also surrounding government and the roles that we can all play within it. The second point goes to Tim's point that one of the things we have missed is a bunch of people are feeling their lives are shit. And they're feeling their lives are shit because they don't have the power, they don't feel empowered to deal with the challenges that they are facing. And there's a quote that goes back to the beginning of the 20th century. Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "Society is happiest when it has the smallest number of things it has to care about." Let me repeat that. Society is happiest when it has the smallest number of things it has to care about. In other words, if you have to be worried about how, so going back to the transition from the 19th to 20th century, some of the things he was writing about were things like sanitation. If you have to worry where your sanitation is going when you flush the toilet, you're not very happy. You would much rather be able to flush the toilet and know it goes away rather than pops back up when you don't want it to. And we expect our governments at the local level to be able to deal with and provide that and never ask a question about what do I have to do to make sure the sanitation goes where it needs to. And one of the reasons focusing on things like CivTech and GovTech is so important is many parts of society right now don't feel government is taking some of those burdens off of them. It's not helping them prepare and be ready to deal with the transitions that are happening because of digitization, because of technology change that is taking jobs away. And so you end up with a large fraction of society, sorry, can I get some water? I'm getting really quite dry. You end up with a large fraction of society which is struggling with a whole bunch of issues that they expect and were promised by polity as a whole would be taken care of for them. So the three recommendations that I have, the three ideas to kick off the conversation, are all about trying to mobilize a conversation that says we need to care about those issues and work to help government take them off of individuals who are struggling with too many issues all at the same time, making their lives feel like shit. So, let me go on to the first of the recommendations. Thank you very much. The first is about scientists, engineers, and technologists. Now, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, because the types of technologists that we have in this room are using their skills and their abilities to focus on societal challenges. But think for a minute, for those of you who have done science or engineering degrees, how much were you trained to think about the social impact of the technologies you were working on or developing? How much were you trained to think about the economic structures, the business models that your technologies were going to be mobilized in, and the impact that was going to have on jobs and society? The challenge when we are developing all of these technologies is that most scientists and engineers are working in corporate structures in an environment which is designed to develop the best technologies to sell products, to create profit, to create opportunities, without necessarily even understanding the implications it's going to have. Let me look at Facebook for a minute and just talk about something. How many of you have been following the fake news debate surrounding Facebook? How many of you are annoyed about reading about the fake news story on Facebook? But I think that story is actually missing the most fundamental issue around the politics of Facebook. It's not the fake news that's going through those sites. It's the fact that the people who are reading that fake news are reading it because the colleagues that they have linked to on Facebook all feel the same thing. And whether they believe the news or not, that fake news is reinforcing for them a particular belief. It's tying into a part of their perspective on the world, and they're saying, yes, that's reaffirming. But because Facebook has allowed individuals to build communities that do span nations in the world, but all share very similar views, it's a self-reinforcing mechanism for generating that belief that life is shit, or that life is bad because foreigners are coming, or life is bad because a Mexican took my job, regardless of the facts. And Facebook as a whole now has a structure that has these very interconnected social networks that are all self-reinforcing beliefs and ideas, whether or not they're true, whether or not it's positive for society. And does Facebook then have a responsibility to break those networks up? To think about, hang on, maybe this group of people that has one particular perspective on the world should also interact with this group over here that has a different perspective on The structure of Facebook and the way it's built has been built because they generate revenue from having likes and social networks and positive reinforcement every time somebody comes online, sees something they like, and reinforces the social networks they have. If they came online, though, and saw something they didn't like, and thought every time I come onto Facebook, I'm going to see a news story I don't like, they likely sign off. But understanding the dynamics, the social dynamics, the economic dynamics of that system isn't something that the technologists themselves are trained and prepared to do in a general sense. It's not something that we build into our engineering education or computer science education. If we did, you could start to see interesting, new, innovative solutions that don't just involve, we're going to look only for trusted news sources, but get to that more fundamental issue about what sort of conversations do we want to be having in society. Now, James talked about a different platform, different ideas, and we've heard there are many different ideas for generating new platforms that you need to get people engaged in and onto if you want to change the political debate. But it's not just about GovTech and CivTech, because retail technologies are changing our society in fundamental ways. Sorry, I'm losing my voice from all the talking this week. The challenge that we face in getting our engineers involved in these conversations can often boil down to concerns about, are engineers and technologists therefore going to be involved in social engineering? Are they going to be involved in deciding, actually, we need to take the liberal groups on Facebook and the conservative groups and force them mingling in conversations? Now, do we have structures in society that do that already? Sure we do. We have schools. In schools, we insist that individuals share and have conversations about different beliefs. It's built into our education system in the early stage of life. But that fades as it goes on in time. Now, I'm not proposing that the right answer is Facebook has to reorganize conversations on its platform. That's unlikely to happen to begin with. But what I am saying is these are the types of challenges and debates we want our technologists and our engineers to be prepared to engage in when they're thinking about technology development. So that it's not just, how do I generate the most likes? How do I generate a platform that will allow advertising to propagate most effectively? But rather, that the social implications are thought. Now, you can use examples of how autonomous vehicles are being rolled out, and the impact that autonomous vehicles are very clearly going to have on our workforces. In the US, 5 million people are employed driving trucks. What happens when you replace that with driverless vehicles and driverless trucks taking around the materials? How do we think about the structure that this technology is, structural change in society that this technology will bring, and integrate a human and a social aspect? I'm not going to promote solutions to these, but I am going to suggest engineering and technology needs to be on the front line of the conversation, not waiting as technology often says, I will produce a technology, it will come out, and then society has to figure out how to structure it. But the way in which those technologies are developed and built end up shaping the choices in an ever narrower way for society along the way, and so we need a more fundamental conversation. Second point, more adaptability, more flexibility. All of these changes, whether it's the sort of changes that digitization is writing on society, or whether it's things like antimicrobial resistance or climate change that I mentioned briefly earlier, these types of challenges and the evolution and pace at which they're moving are not the types of challenges that you can simply say, here's the one-size-fits-all solution, we've solved climate change. We've solved antimicrobial resistance. In fact, we have no idea how to deal with challenges that are so rapidly changing that we could propose a solution today. What we do know how to do is run experiments, particularly experiments within laboratory settings, within university environments. But we need to start thinking about our public policy as experiments in and of themselves. And this is scary. It's scary because it says we actually don't know what we're doing. But the reality is we don't know what we're doing, but in most of the policy formulations that we put forward, we say we have the answer, it's written in statically, and therefore we will go forward on this approach. What we need instead is to be thinking when we're writing our policies about ways that we can test, design put forward the hypotheses underpinning those policies and institutions and build in the flexibility to change them over time. Now, it's easy to say, but it's incredibly difficult to do this. Now, why is it difficult to do this? It's actually not difficult to do this logically. Most of you in the room could probably do this with any number of issues that you really want to work on within society. You could say, I want a policy which is going to clearly address the nationalization issue around the rail system. But you could also say, I'm doing that on the basis of these beliefs that I am not entirely sure whether or not the future would carry out the way I expect it to based on this policy. And you could then say, let's give this smaller pilot issue a try and see whether or not the things I believe are going to happen actually happen. Now, how many politicians do you know that stand up with a platform that says, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'll figure it out along the way? It's not going to get very far as a political campaign, and that is one of the, except in the White House with Trump, that is true. That may actually be the case that undermines my point there. But there is something to that. I'll have to come back to that. But the point being, getting into an environment where we are willing to accept political leaders standing up and saying, I don't have the answer, but I want to run a process that engages people within society to tackle these tough issues, is a change in what we expect of our political leaders. It goes along with the sort of approach that James was talking about, in terms of the platforms that we need in order to possibly mobilize that. But we not only need the change within the political environment, we also need that change within the way the institutions of government are built. Most of the institutions of government were designed in the 1800s and early 1900s, when actually problems didn't change quite as rapidly as we deal with now, or when they did, they were wars. They were simply collapses. In an attempt to avoid that, we need to have a new generation of policymakers much more able to open up and engage across society in terms of open policymaking that engages in conversations about the experiments that we are running and mobilizes support in terms of engaging in the tests of these ideas on the ground, so that we don't end up with, I have the manifesto that I'm going to run on, I run on it, and then I spend 4 years implementing it, regardless of whether the situation has changed around me or any data points that have come in order to accomplish that. And this leads to the third point. What's the role of universities in all of this? What's the role of universities and academics? Universities historically were institutions that were supposed to provide spaces for creative intellectual thinking that pushed society forward. They were liberal environments designed to incubate new ideas and then pass them on through what was effectively, for most of the history of universities, the elite within society. We've seen a massive transition in the last 30 years towards an education system at higher ed, which is supposed to be reaching 50% or more of the population. This is a fantastic transition in terms of making knowledge more accessible. But there's a real question as to whether or not the model that was built to educate a small fraction of the elite, with someone standing at the front of the room talking at you for 4 years, is actually the way that we want to be educating the next generation. Particularly when there are 3 drivers going along in parallel. The first driver is that society expects more from the knowledge that it's paying for than simply to have great academic publications coming out that nobody ever reads. The second is that education can no longer be restricted to the early part of your 20s, and then the knowledge that you have there will last you throughout your entire life. In fact, quite the opposite. Technology and these challenges are changing so fast, by the time you get to the end of a bachelor's degree, the stuff that you've been studying early on may already have moved forward and changed. And we need to have institutions that are capable of not only educating 50% of the population in the early stage of their 20s, but have lifelong learning opportunities. But that increases the volume of people that need to be able to go through it. Now, what does that mean for the design of higher education systems? Well, first thing it means is that the traditional model for an academic of I'm going to go off in the corner and do research on what I care about and thank you society, you should pay for it, that's probably not going to work very long. I hate to tell my colleagues, but we're going to be out of a job if we keep taking that approach. many of them already are feeling that. But what it does mean is there is an opportunity for universities to be part of the change that helps address the governance challenges we're facing in at least two distinct ways. The first is that it can change the way in which we think about the education for scientists, technologists, and engineers to not only be about the mathematics and the physical laws and the chemical laws that's needed to build these devices, but it can also include engaging them throughout their education with real-world problems and real-world policymakers, practitioners, challenges. The second thing is that it can help provide, by doing that with the students, it can be an environment that provides some of the much-needed reflective capacity that governments and societies need to run pilot experiments, to do that adaptive policymaking, to treat policy as an experiment. One of the big challenges with treating policy as an experiment is the fact that government is already overburdened just trying to deliver the ideas around healthcare, the programs around healthcare, the programs around education, the programs around defense, in an era where government budgets are being slashed. And now we're going to ask them to also collect and monitor data on a whole bunch of pilot experiments as you go along in different areas. It's not very practical. But our academic institutions are actually built to do precisely that, to help collect data and understand how to process it and provide feedback. Our academic environments can become much more of an open agora, much more of an open environment for these types of conversations, if we rethink education as not just being about, I teach you something, you then go out into the real world and get a job, but rather an environment where throughout your education, you are dealing with real world challenges, and we are helping coach you through that, which also provides research data for the academics along the way, and it is helping with providing the next generation of knowledge that we need to tackle these challenges. Now, I'm an academic at UCL, as I mentioned, but I went there 4 years ago to set up a new department, which we designed to try and run some of these experiments. The long-winded name that David referred to is Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy, STEEP. I didn't name it, I inherited that. But what we've tried to do along the way is set up undergraduate, graduate education programs that do precisely this. So for our undergrads, we run a program for 800 engineers for 2 weeks every year, in which we bring in the World Bank, the Red Cross, the Department of Energy and Climate Change, the Cabinet Office, city and local government. And they provide them challenges in the form of solve me transport for London, or solve me energy for a refugee camp in Jordan. And unsurprisingly, the engineers who are good at equations turn around and go, where do I start with this? What do you mean solve me transport? What do you mean solve me energy for a refugee camp? And it's precisely that being faced with the real world in which their knowledge could be deployed, the social problems their knowledge could be relevant to, that shifts their perspective. And they learn by spending time first scoping what can my knowledge bring to bear on this type of problem, and then designing solutions that they feed back into these institutions that don't solve transport for London or don't solve energy for a refugee camp, but hone down on specific aspects of those challenges where they can make a substantive difference. And by mobilizing scientists and engineers in this way, we not only give them an education which makes them much more valuable when they go into the real world to work with organizations, but even more importantly, it gives them an understanding of the types of societal challenges that they can impact. We do this similarly with our master's students, where we now have civil servants coming from about a dozen governments around the world, all asking, can you put our civil servants through your master's program to focus on particular pilot challenges? And we work with them to build that sort of adaptive capacity. These are the sort of practical changes that I think we could integrate more throughout our academic systems, which at least would help out the academy again become a vehicle of change for government and society in that governance landscape for dealing with some of these challenges. And I'm guessing I'm a little over time.
That was really impressive. The hardest problem as a moderator is when you've got a speaker who is just so interesting and so fascinating, and so there's no sign of stopping, but And I fear if we started asking questions, we'd run right into the end of the session. So there's a few questions online which will feed to you, Jason, later. I think we do need a break now. Some of our brains are completely exploding with fascinating information.